She bought an abandoned icehouse for just 10, but the doors hadn't been opened in over 60 years. What she found hidden inside wasn't just money or his history, it was a secret about her own grandfather that was never meant to be uncovered. And once she read it, there was no going back. If this story made you feel something, you can hit like or subscribe. It really helps more than you think. And if you're still here, I'm kinda curious, where are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? I love seeing how far these stories travel. Ellie Carter didn't get thrown out in the way people usually imagine. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no moment where everything snapped at once. It was quieter than that, which somehow made it worse. It happened on a Tuesday evening in January, at a small kitchen table that had probably been in the family longer than she had. Her Aunt Maggie sat across from her, hands folded neatly like she'd done 1,000 times before, and explained it the same way she might explain overdue library fines or a book that needed to be returned, calmly, carefully, like she had already rehearsed the words in her head. The house was being sold. The assisted living facility had accepted her application. It was time. Ellie didn't argue. That was the strange part. Most people would have pushed back, tried to negotiate, bought themselves time. But Ellie just nodded, like she understood something deeper than the words themselves. Maybe she did. Maybe growing up the way she had, losing her mom young, learning early that things don't stay, had trained her not to cling too tightly. Still, understanding something doesn't make it easy. It just makes it quieter. By the end of the month, the house that had held every version of her life would belong to someone else. The walls where her height had been marked in pencil. The living room where her grandfather's old tools still hung, untouched but never forgotten. Even the smell of the place would, old books, coffee would disappear into someone else's version of home. And Ellie would be somewhere else. She packed slowly, not because she had a lot, but because every item felt like a decision. What do you take when you don't know where you're going? What matters enough to carry when you can't carry everything? In the end, it came down to a few bags of clothes, a laptop, and one thing she didn't even question: her grandfather's canvas tool roll. It had been sitting in the hallway closet for as long as she could remember, heavy and worn, smelling faintly of oil and cold metal. Maggie had given it to her when she turned 18, with one simple instruction: these aren't decorations. Don't treat them like they are. Ellie hadn't known what that meant back then. She just knew it mattered. For the first time in her life, she became aware of what it meant to not have a place that was hers. Not temporarily crashing somewhere, not staying over, but really not having a fixed point in the world. Maggie had arranged for her to stay with a family friend, a retired teacher named Helen, who had a finished basement and a kindness that felt genuine but still borrowed. Ellie was grateful, she really was. But every night she lay awake staring at a ceiling that wasn't hers, in a house that wasn't hers, and felt something shift inside her. Not panic, not even fear. Just a quiet, steady awareness: this can't be it. About 3 weeks in, on a cold night that felt like every other cold night, Ellie sat on that basement couch with her laptop open, not really looking for anything specific. She had been scrolling through listings, jobs, rooms, cheap apartments, but nothing felt right. Everything felt temporary, like stepping stones that led nowhere. That's when she found it. Not through a search she could explain, but more like something she recognized before she understood why. A listing on a county surplus page, one building, timber frame, abandoned, lakefront property. The price didn't make sense at first: $10. She actually thought it was a typo. Then she saw the photos. A long, low structure sitting near the edge of a frozen lake, surrounded by pine trees. Quiet in a way that didn't feel empty, just forgotten. And then it hit her. She knew that lake. Not from memory the way you remember a place you've been 100 times, but from something older, something almost instinctive. Her grandfather had named it once when she was a kid, standing out on the ice with her bundled up in layers too big for her. He'd pointed across the frozen surface and said the name slowly, like it mattered. Back then it was just another word. Now it felt like a thread being pulled tight. She stared at the screen longer than she needed to. Anyone else would be closed the tab. $10 for a collapsing building in the middle of nowhere isn't a solution. It's a problem. But Ellie didn't see it that way. Or maybe she did and just didn't care. Because for the first time since that conversation at the kitchen table, something felt solid. Not smart, but solid. The next morning, she borrowed Helen's car and drove into town. The kind of drive where the world feels stripped down to essentials: snow, road, sky, music, no distractions. Just time to think, or maybe not think at all. When she got to the county office, the clerk looked at her like he wasn't sure if she was serious. People don't usually come in asking about properties like that. Not at her age, not alone. But she didn't hesitate. She signed the papers, paid the $10, took the key. Just like that, she owned something. It wasn't much, at least not in the way people measure things. The building was old, probably unstable. The land hadn't been maintained in decades. There were 100 reasons why it didn't make sense. But none of those reasons outweighed the one thing Ellie felt as she held that key in her hand. For the first time in weeks, maybe longer, she wasn't drifting. She had a place to go, and she had no idea what was waiting for her there. Ellie didn't grow up thinking her grandfather was extraordinary. To her, Walter Carter had just been there. Quiet, steady, the kind of man who didn't fill a room with words, but somehow still filled it with presence. He didn't tell big stories or give long speeches about life. He showed up, did things with his hands, and if you were paying attention, you learned something. If you weren't, he didn't repeat himself. That was just who he was. Most of what she knew about him came in fragments, the kind you don't realize are important until much later. Her Aunt Maggie would mention in passing that he used to work the lakes, like that was a normal thing people did. Old neighbors would nod when his name came up, sometimes with a kind of quiet respect that Ellie didn't fully understand as a kid. And then there were the objects he left behind, the tools, mostly. Heavy, worn, clearly used for something real. Not decorative, not sentimental in the way people usually keep things, functional, purposeful. It wasn't until she was older that she started to piece together what he had actually done. Walter Carter had been an iceman, not in the abstract, not as a story people tell about the old days, but in the literal sense. He cut blocks of ice out of frozen lakes and stored them for use through the warmer months. Before refrigeration became standard, that was how things stayed cold. Resorts, butcher shops, small town businesses, they all depended on men like him. It was physical work, precise work, and, if you thought about it long enough, dangerous work. But he never talked about it like it was anything special. To him, it was just a job that needed doing. Ellie's clearest memory of him wasn't inside a house. It was outside on a lake, in the middle of winter. She must have been 4, maybe 5. Old enough to remember, but too young to fully understand what was happening. He had taken her out onto the ice, bundled up so tightly she could barely move her arms. The world felt huge and quiet out there. The kind of quiet that presses in on you until you start to notice every little sound, the crunch of snow under boots, the distant call of something in the trees, the subtle, almost unsettling creaks beneath the surface. She remembered being nervous, though she couldn't have explained why. The ice looked solid, endless even, but there was something about standing on it that felt different from standing on ground. Walter noticed. He always noticed. He didn't tell her not to be scared. He didn't say everything would be fine. Instead, he crouched down beside her and tapped the surface with the handle of his tool. "Look at it," he said, his voice calm, almost casual. "Don't guess. Look." She followed his gaze, unsure what she was supposed to be seeing. To her it was just ice. Cold, hard, slightly blue under the light. He pointed again, more specific this time. "See that color?" he asked. "That dark, clear part? That's good ice. That's the kind that holds." Then he shifted slightly, guiding her a few steps over. The ice here looked different, though she couldn't have said how at first. Lighter, cloudier. "This," he continued, "this lies to you, but it's fine, not the same. You don't trust this." He moved once more, just enough to show her a patch where the surface had a dull, almost gray tone. "And that," he said, "you stay off completely. Doesn't matter how it looks from far away. That won't hold you." At the time, it felt like a lesson about ice. Simple, practical, maybe even a little boring once the initial fear wore off. But he made her stand there longer than she expected, made her really look, really notice the differences. He didn't rush her. He didn't explain it twice. He just waited until she stopped seeing ice as one thing and started seeing the variations within it. He let her hold one of the tools that day. It was too big for her, too heavy, and she couldn't do anything with it except feel the weight. But even that seemed intentional, like he wanted her to understand that this wasn't pretend. This wasn't a story or a game. This was real work, done by real people, with real consequences if you got it wrong. Walter died when Ellie was still young. Not suddenly, not in some dramatic way that leaves a clear, sharp memory. It was quieter than that, the way a lot of things in her life seemed to be. One day he was there, sitting in his usual chair, the smell of coffee somewhere nearby, the low hum of a house that had settled into its routines. And then he wasn't. The absence didn't hit all at once. It spread out over time, in small realizations, the tools that stayed where they were, untouched, the stories that stopped being added to, the space at the table that no one quite filled the same way. Maggie kept his things exactly where he left them. The tools stayed in the house, not displayed like relics, but not hidden away either. It was as if she understood that they still mattered, even if no one was using them. On Ellie's 18th birthday, Maggie brought out the canvas tool roll and handed it to her without ceremony. No speech, no emotional buildup. Just a simple transfer of weight from one pair of hands to another. "They were yours now," she said. "But don't treat them like souvenirs." Ellie didn't ask what that meant. Partly because she didn't want to admit she didn't fully understand, and partly because something about the way Maggie said it made it clear that the meaning wasn't something you could explain in a sentence. It was something you had to grow into. For a long time, the tools just existed in her life without a clear purpose. She didn't become an iceman. That world was gone before she was even born. The lake still froze, but no one was out there cutting blocks and hauling them into storage anymore. Technology had moved on, and with it, the need for that kind of work. What remained were the echoes, the stories, the objects, the occasional mention from someone who remembered. And yet, even without a direct use, the influence was there. Ellie found herself drawn to things that required patience, that involved fixing, building, understanding how something worked instead of just replacing it when it broke. She didn't think of it as following in her grandfather's footsteps. It was more subtle than that. It was a way of approaching the world, a quiet preference for things that were real, tangible, dependable. Still, none of it fully connected, not yet. The lesson on the ice, the weight of the tools, the way people spoke about Walter, they were all pieces of something. But the full picture hadn't come into focus. Not while she was growing up, not while she was still in the house, not while everything around her felt relatively stable. It wasn't until much later, sitting in a place that wasn't hers, holding on to a future that didn't feel solid, that those pieces started to shift. The memory of that day on the lake came back, clearer than it had been in years. Not as a nostalgic moment, but as something sharper, more precise. Don't guess. Look. At 4 years old, she had taken it literally. Look at the ice. Learn the difference. Stay safe. At 21, the meaning changed. Because now it wasn't about ice anymore. It was about everything else. The first time Ellie unlocked the icehouse, she didn't feel excitement. Not the kind people expect when you finally arrive somewhere that's supposed to matter. What she felt instead was hesitation. Like her body understood something before her mind caught up. The building sat exactly where the photos had shown it, but being there in person was different. It wasn't just old, it was still. The kind of stillness that doesn't feel empty, just undisturbed. Like it had been waiting, but not for anyone in particular. The walk from where she parked the car took longer than she expected. Snow came up past her boots in places. And every step made that dull crunch that echoes when there's nothing else around to absorb the sound. By the time she reached the building, her hands were cold even through her gloves, and her breath came out in small clouds that disappeared almost as quickly as they formed. She stood there for a moment before doing anything, just looking at it. The wood had darkened with age, the metal roof carried streaks of rust, and the large loading doors at the front were still sealed shut with a heavy chain. It didn't look abandoned in the usual sense, it looked closed, deliberately. The key felt heavier than it should have when she pulled it out of her pocket. It wasn't polished or new. It had weight to it, the kind that comes from being handled over years, maybe decades. She didn't rush. There was no reason to. No one was waiting on the other side. Still, when she stepped forward and slid the key into the lock, her hand paused for just a second. Not fear exactly, just awareness. The lock resisted at first, of course it did. 60 years of not being touched doesn't just give way, because someone shows up with the right key. She had to work it slow and steady, feeling for that moment when metal decides to cooperate again. When it finally turned, the sound was louder than she expected, sharp against the quiet around her. The chain loosened, dropped slightly, and just like that, something that had been closed for decades wasn't anymore. The doors didn't open easily either. They dragged along their track, stiff from time, making a low, grinding sound that seemed to echo inside the building before she even stepped in. When the gap was wide enough, cold air moved past her, not the surface cold of winter but something deeper, older. It caught her off guard in a way she couldn't quite explain. Inside, the space was bigger than it looked from the outside. One long room, high ceiling, heavy beams running overhead. The light from the open doors didn't reach far, and for a moment her eyes had to adjust, picking shapes out of shadow. There was nothing in there. No equipment, no leftover tools, no obvious signs of recent activity. Just wood, structure, and that same stillness she had felt outside, only stronger here. She stepped in slowly, her boots making a hollow sound against the floor. The air felt different, thicker somehow, like the building was holding on to something it wasn't ready to let go of. She moved along the wall, running her gloved hand across the wood almost without thinking. It was solid. Surprisingly so. Whatever this place had been built for, it had been built to last. Ellie didn't go there expecting to find anything. Not really. In her mind, this was just a structure, something she would eventually have to figure out how to fix, or at least make livable. But as she moved deeper into the space, something shifted. Not dramatically, just enough to make her slow down, to start paying closer attention. It wasn't one big clue. It was small things. The way certain boards looked slightly different from others. The faint outline of where something might have once been attached. The kind of details you'd miss if you were just walking through. But Ellie wasn't just walking through. She was looking. Really looking, the way she had been taught, even if she didn't realize that's what she was doing. She reached the far end of the building before anything truly stood out. At first, it was just a feeling that something didn't match. 3 planks along the wall, set a little differently than the rest. The grain didn't quite line up, the spacing felt off. It was subtle, easy to ignore. But once she saw it, she couldn't unsee it. She stepped closer, crouched down slightly, and ran her fingers along the edge where the planks met the others. No nails. That was the first thing she noticed. Everything else in the building was fixed in place, secured the way structures are meant to be. These weren't. They were held in by something else, something intentional but not permanent. For a second, she just stayed there, hand resting against the wood, heart beating a little faster than it had been a moment ago. This was the point where most people might hesitate, where you ask yourself if you reimagining things, if it's worth the effort, if maybe it's better to leave something alone. But Ellie didn't step back. She pressed upward, testing the edge. There was resistance, then a slight give enough. She adjusted her grip and pulled carefully, not forcing it, just applying steady pressure. The panel shifted. Not much, but enough to confirm what she already knew. This wasn't part of the original wall. It was something added, something hidden. When it finally came loose, it didn't fall or break. It moved as one piece, hinged at the bottom in a way that told her this had been opened before. A long time ago, maybe. But not just once. Behind it, the space was darker, a small cavity carved out between the inner and outer walls. Cleared intentionally, protected. And inside that space, exactly where it had been placed all those years ago, was a box. It wasn't large, maybe the size of a small toolbox made of wood, simple in design but solid. There was no dust covering it, no sign of decay. The environment inside the wall had done exactly what it was meant to do, preserve. Ellie didn't reach for it right away. Instead, she sat back slightly, just looking at it, trying to process the moment. Because this wasn't random. This wasn't something left behind by accident. Someone had put this here on purpose, closed it off, and walked away knowing it might never be found. And for reasons she couldn't fully explain, Ellie already knew who that someone was. The realization didn't come as a shock. It settled in slowly, like a memory surfacing rather than a discovery being made. The tools. The stories, the way her grandfather had lived, worked, thought. This fit. Too well to be anything else. Only then did she reach forward and lift the box out of the wall. It had weight to it. Not overwhelming, but enough to make it clear there was something inside. Something real. She carried it carefully toward the open doors, back into the light, each step measured without her consciously deciding to do so. Outside, the world felt different again. Brighter, colder in a more familiar way. She set the box down on the wooden ramp and sat beside it, her breath steady but her mind moving faster now. Trying to catch up with everything that had just happened. For a long moment, she didn't open it. Because somewhere deep down, she understood something important. Whatever was inside that box wasn't just going to explain the past. It was going to change how she saw it. Ellie didn't open the box right away, and that hesitation stayed with her even after she finally did. It wasn't fear in the dramatic sense, not the kind that makes you drop something and step back. It was quieter than that. More like the feeling you get when you know, without knowing exactly why, that whatever you're about to learn is going to change the shape of something you've always believed. She sat there on the edge of the loading ramp, the frozen lake stretched out in front of her, the box between her hands, and for a moment she just listened to the wind moving through the trees, to the faint creak of the building behind her, to her own breathing trying to stay steady. When she finally opened it, she expected something simple. Maybe old tools, maybe documents, maybe nothing that really mattered outside of sentimental value. But what she found didn't feel small. It felt deliberate. The journal came first, thick and worn but carefully kept, every page filled in a steady, practiced hand. Not rushed, not messy, someone had taken time with this. Then the coins, heavier than they looked, their weight immediate and real in a way paper never is. And then the letter, folded neatly, sealed in a way that made it clear it wasn't meant to be opened lightly. She started with the journal. At first, it read exactly like what it seemed to be, a record of work. Dates, temperatures, measurements, notes about the ice. It was precise, almost clinical, the kind of documentation you keep when the details matter. And they did matter. Out there on a frozen lake, guessing wrong isn't an inconvenience. It's a mistake you don't get to fix. So every line had a purpose. Every entry told a small piece of a much larger story, years of winters, seasons repeating. The same lake behaving just differently enough each time to demand attention. As she read, she started to feel something she hadn't expected. Not nostalgia, not exactly pride, but recognition. This was the world her grandfather had lived in, not as a story someone else told, but as something he had written himself, line by line. It made him feel closer, more real. Not just the quiet man in the chair, but the person who had stood out there in the cold, making decisions that mattered. And then, somewhere near the end, the tone shifted. Not dramatically. If you weren't paying attention, you might miss it. But Ellie had been paying attention for a while now. The entries got shorter, less detail, more space between the lines. It wasn't obvious, but it was there, the kind of change you feel more than see. She flipped forward, scanning more quickly now, looking for the point where it changed. The moment where something stopped lining up the way it had before. And she found it. Not in a big bold statement, not in anything that called attention to itself. Just a single entry that didn't sit right. The conditions described didn't match what came after. The ice thickness noted on one day didn't align with the decision made the next. It wasn't impossible, but it didn't feel consistent. And once that thought settled in, she couldn't shake it. She went back, reread the surrounding entries, checked the details again, slower this time. That's when she noticed something else. A gap. Not a missing page in the obvious sense, not a tear or a jagged edge. It was cleaner than that. A section where the flow of entries suggested something had been removed carefully, intentionally. The kind of removal done by someone who knew exactly what they were taking out and why. Ellie sat back slightly, the journal still open in her hands, and felt that same quiet shift again. The one that had stopped her before opening the box. Only this time it was stronger. Because now it wasn't just the existence of something hidden. It was the suggestion that something had been taken away. She set the journal down and reached for the letter. The paper was heavier than she expected, the fold crisp despite the years. When she broke the seal, she did it slowly, not out of caution but out of respect for the moment itself. The handwriting inside was unmistakable. The same steady, controlled lines she had just seen in the journal. But here there was something else underneath it. Not hesitation, not exactly regret, but awareness. As if the person writing knew that what he was putting down mattered in a different way than numbers and measurements ever had. The letter explained the basics. The end of the trade, the shift to refrigeration, the closing of the icehouse. It was practical, almost detached in parts, like he was documenting the end of something inevitable. But then it moved past that. Into something more personal, though still restrained in that same way he had always been. He talked about leaving the journal behind, about preserving the record of the work, the years, the people who had been part of it. He mentioned the money, the purpose it had once served, the idea that it should go to whoever found it. It all made sense, it all fit. Except for what wasn't there. He never mentioned a mistake, never mentioned a problem, never acknowledged the inconsistency she had just seen in the journal. And that absence, more than anything written on the page, is what stayed with her. Because Ellie had spent enough time around things that didn't quite hold to recognize the feeling. She closed the letter slowly and sat there for a long time, looking out at the lake without really seeing it. The surface was frozen, flat and quiet under the pale winter light. It looked solid, it looked safe. But now she couldn't stop thinking about what lay underneath. Later, when she started asking questions, the answers didn't come easily. People remembered her grandfather, but memory has a way of smoothing things out over time, making rough edges less sharp, filling in gaps with what feels right instead of what actually happened. Most of what she heard was consistent with what she had always believed. He was skilled, reliable, respected, the kind of man others trusted. But every now and then, there was a pause, a slight hesitation before someone answered, a glance away, just for a second too long. And if Ellie pushed, gently, carefully, the story would shift just a little. Not enough to be called a confession. Not enough to stand on its own, but enough. Enough to suggest that something had happened that winter. Something that didn't fit the version of events everyone preferred to remember. It wasn't a dramatic revelation. There was no single moment where everything became clear. Instead, it built slowly, piece by piece, until the outline of it was impossible to ignore. There had been an accident, on the lake, late in the season, when the ice can look stronger than it is. Someone had gone through. And the part that mattered most, the part Ellie couldn't look away from once she saw it, was that her grandfather might have known the risk was there. Not with certainty. Not in a way that makes him a villain in a simple, easy story. But enough to raise a question he never answered. Enough to leave a gap in the record that no one had filled. Sitting there with the journal, the letter, and the weight of that possibility settling in, Ellie realized something she hadn't been prepared for. The hardest part of inheriting something isn't carrying it forward. It's deciding what to do when you finally see it clearly. By the time the offer came in, Ellie already knew it wasn't really about the money. On paper, it looked like the kind of deal people wait their whole lives for, a clean way out of uncertainty. A chance to trade something fragile for something stable. The man who brought it to her didn't rush, didn't pressure. He walked the property slowly, like he respected it, like he understood what it could become. A lakeside development, small cabins, maybe a boutique resort. People are looking for places like this again, he said, almost casually, quiet, authentic. He used that word like it meant something fixed, something you could package and sell without changing it. And maybe, to him, it did. Ellie listened. She didn't interrupt, didn't argue, didn't pretend she hadn't thought about it already. Because she had. More than once. Every time she looked at the numbers, every time something else in the building needed fixing. Every time she woke up in the cold and wondered how long she could keep doing this. The money would solve everything, at least in the way people define solving. A place to live, no more guessing, no more stretching every dollar until it felt thin. It would be easy to say yes. It would make sense. But sense had started to feel different to her. That night, she sat alone in the icehouse. The kind of quiet that had become familiar now settling around her like something almost solid. The journal was open beside her, the letter folded back along its original creases. She had read both more times than she could count, not because she expected them to change, but because she was trying to understand where she fit inside them. The version of her grandfather she had grown up with still existed. That didn't disappear just because she had learned something new. But it wasn't the whole picture anymore. And that was the part she couldn't ignore. She thought about the way people had spoken about him, the respect in their voices, the certainty. She thought about the pauses too, the things left unsaid. And she realized something that hadn't been obvious before. Most people don't remember the truth. They remember the version of it that lets them move on. The version that holds. Ellie stood up and walked toward the open doorway, looking out at the lake. It was late enough that the light had flattened, the surface of the ice turning that deep, muted color that made it hard to read from a distance. For a second, she saw it the way she had as a kid, just a frozen expanse, simple and still. But then the memory layered over it, her grandfather's voice, steady and quiet. Don't guess. Look. She stepped out onto the ramp, then down onto the lake itself, her boots finding the surface with a dull, solid sound. She didn't go far. Just enough to feel the space around her, the same space he had worked in, the same place where something had gone wrong. The cold moved through her, sharper out here, more immediate. She looked down, not quickly, not nervously, but with intention. The ice wasn't uniform. it never had been. Even now there were differences if you took the time to see them. Slight shifts in color, in texture, in the way the light moved across it. It wasn't dangerous, not in the immediate sense, but it wasn't perfect either. And that was the point. For the first time, she understood the lesson completely. It wasn't about avoiding the weak spots. It was about recognizing them, accepting that strength and weakness exist side by side. Sometimes so close together you can't separate them without really paying attention. Her grandfather hadn't taught her to trust the ice blindly. He had taught her to see it for what it was. And now she had to decide if she was willing to do the same with him. The next morning, when the investor came back, Ellie didn't take long to answer. She didn't give a speech, didn't try to explain everything she had been thinking. Some decisions don't translate well into words, especially to someone who isn't part of the question. She just shook her head slightly and said no, calm, direct, final. He didn't argue. People like him usually don't when they realize the answer isn't about negotiation. He nodded, said he understood though it was clear he didn't fully, and left her with a number in case she changed her mind. She knew she wouldn't. Keeping the icehouse didn't fix anything overnight. It didn't make the work easier or the future more certain. If anything, it made things harder. There were still repairs to be done, still costs she hadn't planned for. Still days where the weight of it all felt heavier than she wanted to admit. But something had shifted in a way that mattered more than any of that. She stopped trying to preserve a version of the past that no longer held. Instead, she started telling the story the way she had come to understand it. Not just the parts that sounded good, not just the legacy that made people comfortable. All of it. The work, the skill, the years of doing something difficult well. And also the uncertainty, the risk, the possibility that even someone experienced, someone careful, could make a call that didn't hold. At first, it felt strange, almost like she was breaking something that wasn't hers to break. But the more she did it, the more it felt right. Because the story didn't become smaller when she told the truth. It became real. People still came, not in huge numbers, not all at once, but steadily. Some out of curiosity, some because they had heard something about the place. She would walk them through the building, show them the structure, the way it had been designed, the way it still held after all these years. She would show them the journal, the records, the careful attention to detail that had defined the work. And then, when the moment felt right, she would tell them about the part that didn't fit. She didn't dramatize it. She didn't try to make it bigger than it was. She just laid it out the same way her grandfather had once pointed out the differences in the ice. This part holds. This part doesn't. You need to know the difference. Some people didn't like that version of the story. You could see it in the way they shifted, the way they looked for a cleaner ending, something easier to take with them. But others stayed longer, asked questions, looked at the lake differently when they stepped outside. Those were the ones who understood. One evening near the end of her 4th year there, Ellie sat on the edge of the ramp again, watching the light fade across the water as it moved toward winter. The air carried that early hint of cold, not sharp yet, but coming. She thought about everything that had led her here, all the small decisions that had added up to something she never would have planned. She thought about her grandfather too, not as the man she had once believed him to be, and not as the version that the missing page suggested, but as both. A person who had done something well for a long time, who had understood his work, who had taught her something that lasted, and also someone who had faced a moment where the line between holding and not holding wasn't as clear as it should have been. For a long time, she had believed that the lesson he gave her was about certainty, about knowing without question what was safe and what wasn't. Now she understood it differently. It wasn't about certainty. It was about attention, about being willing to look closely, even when what you see isn't simple. Even when it changes the way you feel about something you thought you understood. Ellie rested her hands on the worn wood beside her, feeling the solidness of it, the way it had held through years of use and years of being left alone. The icehouse wasn't perfect, neither was the story it carried, but it was real, and that, she had decided, was enough. Because in the end, the choice hadn't been between holding on and letting go. It had been between pretending something was solid and learning how to stand on it as actually is. Ellie stood there for a moment, looking out across the lake as the last light slipped away. From a distance the ice looked perfect, smooth, unbroken, like it could hold anything. But she knew better now. She stepped forward, slow and steady, eyes down, not guessing, just reading. A shift in color, a faint line beneath the surface. Small things most people would miss. She nodded to herself, then turned and walked back toward the icehouse. Because she didn't need the ice to be perfect anymore. She just needed to see it for what it really was. What stayed with me after this story isn't the money, or the hidden box, or even the idea of rebuilding something from nothing. It's that moment when everything Ellie believed about her grandfather stopped being simple. Because that's the part most of us don't talk about, what happens when something we've trusted our whole lives suddenly feels uncertain. When the story we've been telling ourselves no longer holds the way it used to. I think a lot of us go through life the same way Ellie did at the beginning. We want things to be clear. Good or bad. Strong or weak. Right or wrong, it's easier that way. It lets us move forward without second guessing every step. But life doesn't really work like that. People don't either. Even the ones we look up to, even the ones who shaped us, they were not perfect. And sooner or later, if we were paying attention, we start to see the cracks. The instinct is to pull away from that, to ignore it or smooth it over, or rewrite the story so it feels comfortable again. Because it's hard to hold on to something once you've seen where it might break. But what this story quietly suggests is that maybe the goal was never to find something that's unbreakable. Maybe it's to learn how to see things as they actually are, not worse than they are. Not better than they are, just clearly. Ellie could have walked away. She could have taken the easier version of the story, the one where her grandfather was only what people said he was, and the icehouse was just a lucky find. That version would have been cleaner, lighter. But it also would have been incomplete. And there's a cost to that, even if we don't always feel it right away. Instead, she chose something harder. She chose to stay, to look closer, to live with a version of the truth that didn't fit neatly into one category. And more importantly, she chose not to hide from it. She didn't let the imperfection ruin the meaning, she let it deepen it. I think that's the real takeaway. Not that everything has a hidden flaw, or that we should distrust everything we've been taught, but that there's value in being honest about what we see, even when it complicates things. Especially then. Because that's where understanding actually starts, not in certainty, but in attention. The lesson her grandfather gave her wasn't really about ice. It was about noticing. About slowing down enough to see the difference between what looks solid and what actually is. And that applies to more than just a frozen lake. It applies to the decisions we make, the people we trust, the stories we carry with us. At some point, we all step out onto something we believe will hold, a relationship, a plan, a version of ourselves. And sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't. But the difference isn't always obvious from a distance. So maybe the point isn't to avoid every risk or find something perfectly safe. Maybe it's to learn how to read the surface a little better. To pay attention. To accept that strength and weakness can exist in the same place, at the same time. Because once you can do that, once you can see clearly, without needing everything to be perfect, you're not as easily shaken when things shift underneath you. And that might not make life easier, but it makes you steadier.